So here's what John Loftus says. He says, dispensing higher critical studies and just taking the Bible at face value, what are we to make of the way that God communicated, given the final canonical Bible? My claim is that God did a woefully inadequate job, especially since he's supposedly omniscient and knows how sinful people such as us could misunderstand his words. So what do you make of Loftus's take on biblical ambiguity, and how would you respond, Randall?
Yeah. Loftus presents an argument. I think he calls it the argument from miscommunication. And so the idea here, the assumption is that, well, if God's going to communicate to us, we should expect a text of maximal clarity, or a communication of maximal clarity for the maximal number of people. And if the text fails to provide that, then we have good reason to think that it didn't actually come from God. The first thing I want to just kind of highlight is he uses this word face value. He says that we should take the Bible at face value. I'm not even sure what that means, to be honest, because people disagree as to what face value even looks like. Take, for example, the way that God is repeatedly described in Scripture in human terms, as having a body, as sitting on a throne, as having a right arm, a face, hair of wool, a finger, and so on. So repeatedly, God is described in human terms. One person will look at that and say, well, at face value, God is humanoid. He's like us. And of course, Mormons, who I mentioned earlier, actually do take that view. Another person says, well, at face value, in fact, we should interpret these as metaphors. God is being described in anthropomorphic terms, but that's an accommodation to the human reader. God is not, in fact, literally sitting on a throne. He does not literally have an arm, a right hand, hair like wool, and so on. And so the question of face value is not a simple one. And I think that we have to be very careful about assuming that there is some default, just natural, obvious reading of passages, whether it is the passages that describe God in human terms, or whether it's the passages that describe God commanding genocide. Having said that, that does set up the question for us. Because the question then is, okay, if it isn't clear what the face value reading is, or the obvious reading, why did God communicate this text to us, which is not in the terms that we would expect? Here we need to take a step back and say, okay, the whole question itself is prefaced on an assumption about what the Bible is, what its purpose of communication is. So one example I've used in another one of my books is that many people, and growing up, I grew up conservative evangelical / fundamentalist, so we sometimes call it fundagelical, in a very similar background, in fact, to John Loftus. So I think I know the kind of way that he's approaching the Bible here, because I approached it like that growing up. I thought of the Bible, you can think of it as like when you walk into a hotel room and you look on the back door of the hotel room and there is a map for, in case of fire, how to exit the hotel most expeditiously, how to get quickly out of the hotel in case of fire. Now, for a hotel map showing you how to exit the hotel in case of fire, you should not expect any ambiguity. There should not be room among the people in the hotel as to how to interpret the various directives on the hotel to exit in case of fire, because the whole point of the map is simply to get you out of the hotel in case of fire. And I think that people like Loftus, when they present the objection like this, they have an assumption that the Bible functions like that map. It's an escape route to get out of hell, essentially. And that's what the Bible is really about. And so if there's any ambiguity or room for reasonable disagreement in the communication and reading of the text, that is on the fault of the author for failing to achieve the ends of maximal clarity. But what if that is not the point of the Bible in the first place? What if thinking about the Bible as functioning like a map for an escape route in case of fire is simply a flawed metaphor? What if God is doing something entirely different, and the purposes for which God has in writing Scripture and giving it to us is to meet his very different purposes, which do include some degree of ambiguity in the text? In that case, and on that scenario, this whole conundrum is in fact a false one. Because God did not fail the ends for which he purposed Scripture. So I would challenge Loftus's whole assumption as to what the Bible is even there for.